Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, Part 1. So I wanted to go through a yearly tradition of reviewing a different Treehouse of Horror every Halloween. And so I'm going to start with the very first one. Treehouse of Horror was kind of a break from the normal episode of The Simpsons, as this suddenly became a horror comedy show and not a wacky cartoon about a family. It was a kind of a way to break up the episodes, but also to have a Halloween special. Now, this wasn't actually as unprecedented as maybe a lot of people will lead you to believe. Lots of sitcoms did have Halloween specials, and a few actually did try to do horror stories with it. In particular, one show that did it quite frequently was Roseanne, and would have just segments of like someone getting their arm cut off or something, something crazy like that, and doing various pranks. But no one really did what the Simpsons were doing, which were doing kind of EC horror type of tales, and this really set the precedent. Now, when this episode starts with Marge coming out of the curtain and saying how, this might be too scary for some children, that's half a parody and half probably a real concern. It is referencing the beginning of the original Frankenstein, having a guy come out and say, Carl Laemmle told you that this movie is too scary. And that's always been a horror thing, saying, oh, this is too scary, you don't want to see this, and then of course people do. It was also because The Simpsons were actually sort of controversial. I grew up as a kid when this aired, and I knew a lot of parents who wouldn't let their kids watch The Simpsons, which seems pretty ridiculous. But if you consider both that they had problems with The Simpsons and horror and violence were also not cool for baby boomer parents at the time, I can't imagine that they expected that this episode would probably go down very well. So it was probably part, they were like, let's reference a classic film, which it's interesting how Simpsons references change, particularly with Treehouse of Horror, because early on they were all pretty much older references. They make a few like more current 1990 kind of references, which is when this aired, October 25th, 1990. But they usually kept it kind of classy and doing kind of classic film and classic TV tropes and EC Comics things as well. But they kind of knew that this would be a little controversial because parents would object. And I've heard various podcasts and reviews from people who said, oh, this was the one that made my parents not let me watch The Simpsons anymore. This just made my parents want to keep not letting me watch The Simpsons and stuff. My parents did let me see this episode, so depending on how you feel about that, and I turned out sort of fine, I guess. Now, this takes up 3 individual segments. One is Bad Dream House, the other Hungry Are the Damned, and then their rendition of The Raven. Bad Dream House kind of combines Amityville Horror and obviously Poltergeist. What's interesting about each of these different segments is they're actually all directed by different people. Now, a common thing with all of the Simpson Treehouse of Horrors is they always have different writers for each segment, or at least credited writers. That's never really changed. However, this is the only Treehouse of Horror to have 3 different directors, which you can actually tell from really the vibe of this. This one does have a different vibe. It's actually the only Treehouse of Horror episode to take place in an actual treehouse, or at least I haven't seen them after a certain point, but to my understanding. And they would eventually get rid of the wraparound kind of host segment type of thing. It's interesting, the 3 directors, Wes Archer, Rich Moore, and David Silverman, I think do a good job, and actually they feel very distinctly different. Not that the ones later don't, but maybe I'm giving too much credit because you know that information, but they do feel like radically different, particularly the end one with The Raven. The first one, Bad Dream House, which of course is parodying both Poltergeist and the Amityville Horror, is actually, I think, really funny. Probably one of the more scarier and modern of the 3, especially in terms of its influences, although I guess its latest influence is like 1980, so I mean that's not that modern really. I like what they do with it. It moves very quickly. Like, I was shocked sometimes, like I think I dropped a pen and I looked down and I went up and I had to rewind like a whole 5 jokes. Like, it just is like boom, boom, boom. Particularly that one I noticed. It doesn't really do setup. It's like, okay, we're into this. Let's go, let's go. I like that rhythm to it. It actually works and finds a way to build mood at the same time, which really shows how impressive The Simpsons really are. I like Harry Shearer, particularly as the house, because he does play off of like your brains will pop out of your skull, your eyes, and go in some scary stuff. And like, he both does the scary thing, because I remember watching this as a kid that was actually sort of scary, but now I'm like, he was clearly like doing the scary voice and playing it up and probably scaring children, but also he was being funny, get also horrible things, and like, he definitely like plays into how ridiculous it is, but he's also able to get the scary voice of it, and it says a lot about Harry Shearer as a performer. There's a lot of really good performances in this, and different performances than you see from a lot of Simpsons actors, which I actually think is one of the cool highlights of this. There's a lot of acting in this that, like, I've seen this, I really could not tell you how many times I've seen this particular Treehouse of Horror, like from since it aired like every year almost to now, to sit down with it and really like review it, I was kind of surprised how good the acting was and how other acting things I didn't necessarily notice, really. In Bad Dream House, I particularly like the one joke that's cut for syndication, so I don't think I've seen that joke very many times, despite seeing this episode very many times, where Homer calls Mr. Plutz, I think, who sold him the house, about the ancient Indian burial ground. He says they mention it 5 or 6 times. And I also like the visual gag where he opens it's like literally just in the basement with gravestones. Like, they didn't do a poltergeist where they actually put forth the effort in moving the bodies. In this, they just build it on top of it. No one goes in their basement. We'll be fine. But it is a good gag, and it works visually for a cartoon. So I mean, logistically, I understand you wouldn't actually do that. You would actually move the bodies, which is horrible. You should never leave burial grounds alone in general. But I like they say it's an ancient Indian burial ground, and one of the headstones actually says Mahatma Gandhi, which I thought was pretty clever. The next one, which is Hungry Are the Damned, is of course a parody of the Twilight Zone episode To Serve Man. I haven't seen actually that episode of the Twilight Zone, but it would start a tradition of Treehouse of Horror episodes actually parodying episodes of the Twilight Zone, and for kids of my generation is actually how we became familiar with most of those stories, to be honest with you. That's actually probably the only one I haven't seen the real Twilight Zone episode of. I'm kind of curious why they didn't just keep remaking Twilight Zone episodes for Treehouse of Horror. I think we'd all be fine with that. One thing that happens in all of these episodes is there's suddenly like a color change, whether it's green or like when Lisa runs down the hall and this suddenly becomes red, and like the drastic color change, like they have a gel on the lights or on the camera lens or something, which is kind of interesting. Shows you like how much more dynamic I guess the show was when it was a little more off model and so forth. They had a lot of fun with that, particularly in these episodes. But Hungry Are the Damned, I liked how it plays on the distrust of humans and has a lot of fun with the Kang and Kodos thing, which of course this is where they're introduced, and quite memorably with Serac the Preparer, or how I guess we're supposed to pronounce it, because originally they say to properly pronounce it he'd have to rip out our tongues. I particularly like James Earl Jones. He's a mover really quickly in the Bad Dream House. He's Serac the Preparer in this, and he's the narrator of The Raven, and he does an amazing job. But apparently in this, to do the voice, he was like chewing on a cookie at the same time. And James Earl Jones is like, I think you already know he's a great actor. I don't really need to say it, but he's like, believe he has a Tony. He's like a very theatrical actor, and it's funny how like he is able to do that in The Raven, but in Hungry Are the Damned, he's able to play up and be an alien. It seems like he had a lot of fun. James Earl Jones just seems like an awesome guy in general. I think Hungry Are the Damned is probably one of the most remembered and most liked and most beloved because of the space dust joke. They only say space dust at the end of blowing it. That's the last, oh, there's more space dust. They just say it's dust. They don't say it's space dust, which I was shocked this time. There's a lot of interesting things when you rewatch Simpsons, have a million times like I have, certain episodes, and then I'll watch it and go, oh, they actually don't say that part till the end. I just think they say it every time, but they only say space dust at the end, which is interesting. And I think Kang and Kodos are great and very memorable. The interesting thing is both Hungry Are the Damned and Bad Dream House feel more connected. They both end with Lisa doing a quote at the end of it, like it's like a classic, like The Thing from Another World type of thing. I noticed there's more of a connection between those two, and then The Raven feels like its own thing. Now I know that Matt Groening wasn't really thrilled about The Raven, and it is really something I don't think they've ever done again, and I've always liked it as a kid. I think really thinking about the poem, it's more of like a horrorness of just life in general and moving on without a loved one, particularly your wife, which is horrifying, but horrifying not in like a scary way, more horrifying in the rest of my life is doomed way. But hey, that's Edgar Allan Poe, I guess. There's certain parts of this I love. I've always loved the reading of James Earl Jones in this, who's amazing, and there's a real theatricality in terms of like theater in this that James Earl Jones really brings to it. But I think what people always miss about this is Dan Castellaneta, or the voice of Homer, Dan Castellaneta, whatever, the voice of Homer, does an absolutely amazing job. Like, he is really fucking doing it in this. And like James Earl Jones, you expect him with this booming, amazing voice to be able to deliver those lines. But Dan Castellaneta, I think, like, just like is absolutely like just sells it in certain parts. Like, he's screaming, he's got all this dialogue, and he manages to do it in a way that just like really sells the thing. It's probably one of his better performances, and a lot of people say it shows more of the range than Homer would later have. I don't love how Bart interjects so much, and sometimes I'm like, Bart, like, chill the fuck out, just let us get through this. And I think when I was a kid I was more fine with it when he goes, eat my shorts, you know what's better than nothing? Anything. And that's Bart, and that's how Bart is, particularly at this time, but it's still a little like, like, can we just do the Raven thing? I'm curious if this was influenced by the famous UPA cartoon of the Telltale Heart, and maybe that's why the precedent was there to do this, but I might just be reading into things and bringing up animation history to make myself look smarter than I probably am. I still have always liked the Raven. I know it's like completely artistically different from most Treehouse of Horrors and Simpsons things, but I like that they were able to like challenge themselves in such a way, even though most people, I think, it's sort of divided on who worked on it, whether it was a good idea or not, but I always thought it was cool when I was a kid that they were reading the Raven. I think I just like it because there was Raven in it. I don't think I really got any of the themes of the poem until I was older. I like that Edgar Allan Poe is a credited writer in a cartoon in 1990. That shows the power of Edgar Allan Poe, that he's still relevant at that point. This was actually, interestingly enough, and I sort of remember this, and I mean, you can say it from the title card, it says The Simpsons Halloween Special, and I remember it being advertised as such. I didn't know it as Treehouse of Horror until later. Obviously, this episode is actually called Treehouse of Horror, which, you know, makes sense. They're in a fucking treehouse and stuff. It's interesting how that changed and how it was really sold as a Halloween special, and I think they knew because animated stuff, you know, has specials. I remember my sister and I would get so excited for Halloween specials and Thanksgiving specials and Christmas specials. Like, they were such a big deal to us. And so I think in terms of animation, it made a lot of sense because you can just re-air these things. I remember actually watching maybe the first Treehouse of Horror marathon. I think it was like when the third or fourth one aired, or even the fifth one. Like, I remember they would do marathons for a while and then they stopped doing them, but I think around 6 or 7, but they would play all of them. And it was like an exciting thing as a kid. Like, I've watched them in a marathon of like the classic kind of first 5 seasons in that way for a long time because they would air it that way. And now I think they do that on FXX, but it felt like special then because you wouldn't do that this is on Fox itself. I've always liked this one. I obviously, it seems like it's not one that's as well remembered. It seems like the later ones get more reviews and more attention. I kind of like the EC comicsness of it. I like the kind of little kids telling ghost stories, which obviously they would replicate to a certain extent with the second one. But I like the precedent it sets. I think it was a cool idea for The Simpsons because of the kind of references they were doing at this time to do things with EC Comics and Twilight Zone. And also it was a cool horror tradition. There isn't a lot of horror in animation. I mean, there is some. I mean, it's not completely not there, but there isn't as much as you would hope there would be. And I think The Simpsons kind of like is the hallmark really of that. They're able to really play in that animation horror world. And this wasn't as gory as they would be certainly later, but it kind of was testing the waters to see what they could get away with. But I like that they combined different kind of horror, a haunted house thing, an alien abduction thing, a classic gothic poem. You know, they played around with the form a lot. And it's interesting to see these writers, and particularly they had such an amazing writing staff and directors and all these creative people, to let them play around on Halloween. Gets into the spirit of Halloween. If you're going to dress up and do something different, become kind of a different persona, and for one time during Halloween, The Simpsons could. This was the first time The Simpsons were airing in October, and so it's kind of interesting that they started this tradition in season 2. It's kind of like one of their bigger traditions. Obviously, they'd have episodes that they do other breaks from that and such, but I think Treehouse of Horror is probably most people's favorite segment and so forth. I like the kind of idea of Lisa kind of being the kind of keeper of the tales and kind of like the moral compass to a lot of this stuff. I thought was I mean, obviously that's going on anyway, but bringing her to more of like this horror Halloween setting I thought naturally worked very well for her. The yearly tradition of Treehouse of Horror is always something I've always really loved. It might not really be as into it in its current setting, and I might not have watched as much. I think one of the better things about the earlier ones is they did horror stuff, which animation really needs more of, but it was also, you know, it's Halloween, where you're doing like random movie parodies and so forth. They were really doing horror tales that felt like classic horror tales and playing on EC Comics, particularly Kang and Kodos are very EC Comics, and playing on Twilight Zone and doing like interesting, you know, other versions of horror, particularly when we're just coming out of the slasher thing and the Freddy influence stuff, which they bring up. The Friday the 13th, the original, is tame to today's standards and so forth. I love this episode. I think Treehouse of Horror is a great little series, and I'm excited to go through it yearly, you know, since they've stopped making Simpsons, so this won't become an insurmountable project that I'll never be able to finish. This has a real classic tone to it. I like how kind of spooky it was. It did actually scare me a little bit when I was a kid, because I didn't know much horror then, and I was probably just as scared as Homer, and it did have that creepy, scary element to it, but now it's just kind of like a fun cartoon horror tale. I can't wait to play it for my daughter and any future generations and see how they react to it as well. I think it plays off of both the fun and the scares of Halloween almost so perfectly, and this one just sets the precedent so well, but it definitely sets off this yearly tradition on the right step. So if you have seen Treehouse of Horror Part 1 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.